Welcome back to Traveling Dice. This is Jason. I've got another Goodwill challenge here for you today. With this series, the idea is that I go to Goodwill and I look for something that I can turn into a terrain piece, convert into a miniature, use as inspiration for a D&D scenario, anything like that. And in the last episode of the Goodwill challenge, I found this silo tower thing that had this ramp going around it. Now, if you missed that episode, you might want to go and check it out. It's pretty cool. But I converted the silo tower into a piece of terrain for my Gaslands game. More on the Gaslands game to come in future episodes. But I thought this ramp is kind of cool. And I thought I could actually get a 2-build terrain set out of this one Goodwill purchase. So I was pretty excited about that. And the item only cost me $2. So if I'm able to build 2 pieces terrain, then the general investment's only $1 per piece. So that's awesome. I love that. And when I looked at this ramp, I was thinking Magic Fulcrum, right? The Warhammer Fantasy Storm of Magic book has these cool battles where essentially magic's cranked up to 20 and your wizards are on these fulcrums. You get access to even more powerful spells. You bring extra monsters. But the problem with the fulcrum is that oftentimes they're too small. If you're using the GW ones, they're kind of small. Your wizard has to fit on there. And there are some wizards that are monsters. And yeah, they just don't fit. So I wanted to make a really, really big one with this ramp going up to the top. So at this point in the build, all I've done is taken the last little bit out of the ramp, which was like a sign. I might actually try to reuse that sign for something. And then I made that base that you see there, which is made out of like a chipboard kind of material. Now I think that actually came in a package of like a big purchase. I don't remember what the item was, but I set it aside thinking, oh, this would make great material for basing. Now I cut it with a jigsaw. If you're new to power tools, jigsaw is probably a great entry-level power tool. It's probably one of the least intimidating ones. You do still have to be careful with it. I would suggest, if you haven't used a jigsaw before, that you're watching some safety videos and things of that nature. But it's a good entry-level saw, and it will definitely cut your chipboard for any basing. And then I also beveled the edges of that. Now, I wanted to prime that ramp because I felt like my materials would adhere to it better. And I hate using my GW primer on stuff like this because it's big and it's not particularly detailed, and I'm going to cover most of it up. And it's a waste of really expensive primer. So you might notice in a few clips that I have a bunch of black primer on my hands. And the reason is I used this other brand of primer, and it wasn't even dirt cheap. It was, I would call it moderately priced. And I don't know if I got a bad batch, but it just was horrible. And yeah, I really regretted using it. But, we made do. I hot glued the ramp down to the chipboard. And then what I did was I grabbed some XPS foam, the pink foam. I think I usually purchase it from Home Depot. I like the 2-inch thick if you can find it. Sometimes you can only find it in the 1-inch thick. And yeah, I just buy the big sheets of it. It comes in 4 foot by 8 foot. Usually I'll cut it down in the parking lot into sizes that will fit in the car and go from there. So my goal is to kind of make this rocky cylinder in the center of this ramp. And at the very top will be the top portion that the ramp is leading up to. And then I'm going to fill it in from there. So it's nicely sized for my 2-inch foam here because the top of the ramp is almost exactly 8 inches. So I know I'm going to need 4 pieces of this foam. And I'm just gradually cutting pieces away. I'm deliberately using my knife here to kind of just cut in a little bit and then kind of snap it out. And my hope is that it'll have kind of a rocky look to it doing that as opposed to just cutting. So I am kind of cutting in slightly and then popping it out until it fits. Once I get a fit, then I hot glue it in. And I'm going to repeat this process essentially 4 times. So I have that first piece hot glued into place. And I really do like the hot glue here, in part because it lets me immediately move on. I know that piece is not going to move and it's going to set very quickly. The other reason that I really like the hot glue, especially at the base in this application, is that although that chipboard is fairly thick and it's in a round shape, it still can warp. And I'm always hesitant to put a ton of PVA right on that base. I've had warping issues with some terrain in the past. So you do need to be mindful of those types of terrain bases and that they can warp. Now, a round shape, from what I understand, is less likely to warp than a rectangular or square shape. And you can also mitigate that probably by using the PVA on the base sparingly. Now, there are some steps where I do use PVA on the base, but I'm pretty mindful of that. And by the time I do use the PVA on the base, I already have a lot of material on the base, and it's really the edges applying the sand in a later step here. So where we're at in the process here is that I've added the 4 layers, working my way up to the platform of the magical fulcrum piece of terrain. And I have some gaps, and I knew this was going to be an issue because there was no way I was going to cut those 4 circular pieces in the middle perfectly to fit in perfectly to this spiral. But I don't really want those gaps to be there because I'm trying to kind of create this effect with this piece of terrain that this is like one mountainous thing, and the ramp and everything around it has been carved out. And in order to do that, I don't think there should be a gap between any of the cylinder pieces and the ramp. So I'm filling those gaps in initially by grabbing scraps of the XPS foam and just inserting them into the gaps. And I'm trying to do this like super snugly and looking for pieces that look right. And I'm just using the PVA. Now the PVA is going to take a while to dry. In my opinion, the PVA has a nice advantage in that it's easy to use. It flows a little bit better. Like hot glue just kind of grabs on initially. It has the wisps. You have to work very quickly. Getting it in the wrong spot, in my opinion, is kind of a big deal with the hot glue. Whereas with the PVA, all that is a lot more forgiving. The downside is that your dry time is exponentially higher. So you're definitely looking at hours, depending upon the application, maybe a half a day or even a full day. So some of these parts of the build I end up coming back to. But I'm working my way just all the way around where the cylinder meets the ramp, and I'm filling it in with these scraps of the XPS foam. I should point out that I do have this playing on video at double speed for you here. So although it might look like I'm moving super fast through all these steps, in actuality, I'm moving much slower. But here I'm just taking a rock from the garden that has a bunch of jagged areas, and I'm kind of mashing it into that top section. I don't want it to be smooth. I want it to have some texture. You can do this with a foil ball as well and kind of roll it around. The tin foil works well with that. And that is definitely a tip that I picked up from Black Magic Craft. If you somehow discovered this channel and you're not familiar with Black Magic Craft, honestly, just pause this right now and go check out that channel. And then I'll see you in like 6 months. But amazing crafting channel. So you'll see a few things that I do where definitely I learned them from Jeremy at Black Magic Craft. So kudos to him. But yeah, I just wanted to apply texture to that top platform. And in this case, I used the rock. I think the danger with using the rock is that you keep making the same pattern over and over again. So I did try to rotate it in my hand, so hopefully that wasn't the case. But you want to be mindful of that. So having filled in most of the gaps, or as many of the gaps as I could, I start working on filling out the base. And I want the base to be really, really stout. So I'm adding in these big chunks of the XPS foam. I'm using the hot glue here for 2 reasons. One is I want to immediately move on, and then 2 is I know I'm working now on that base, and I'm always kind of thinking about potential warping in the back of my mind. So I add these big chunks just to fill out the base all the way around the perimeter, except for, of course, the area where the ramp starts. I want to have that as a little opening. So Halloween is definitely one of my favorite holidays. And at the last Halloween, I found this bag of small skulls at the Dollar Tree, which is just awesome. The price is right. I like the scale for terrain building. And, if you're following the GW model here, you never have enough skulls, right? So I did go back and forth about whether or not I really wanted to add them to this build, because it does, I think, obviously give it a pretty sinister feel. But I said, yeah, let's do the sinister feel. Let's go a little dark and gothic here. So what I'm doing is I'm adding 3 of these skulls as though the skulls have been carved out of the stone and that they're just part of the structure. So in order to accomplish that, I'm going to make holes that the skulls can just fit in. I hot glue them in place, and then I'm going to try to smooth out that seam and make it look like a smooth, rocky, like it's really just coming out of the rock face. And I'm going to add material to accomplish that in a later step. But all I'm doing right now is just using needle nose pliers. I find that if you need to just really like kind of pull foam out of an area, especially if you're not worried about damaging any of the foam, which at this point I'm not because it's just rocky structure, that using the needle nose pliers, you can kind of open them, stab it in, close them, and pull them out is usually the method that I use. And I find that to be really effective and oddly fairly accurate. Like I find that you're actually pulling out a fairly small amount at a time. So I do really like the needle nose pliers for that application. But I get the 3 skulls in place. I want them kind of spread out. I want them to be kind of around the area where the ramp is going up and then moving up towards the top. So I also have it right underneath the spiral thing there. So I think it's kind of maybe not something that you notice at first, hopefully, when it's done. But then at different angles, it kind of pops out at you. And I'm hoping that it has a nice effect at the end. All right, so I got all 3 skulls in place. You will notice that they're painted now, and I did this off camera, but after I hot glued them in place, I actually realized I made a mistake. Normally, I would prime things like that, a plastic piece that's going in with foam, prior to putting it in place. The reason for this is that you can paint directly on the foam with relative ease, but painting on a plastic skull just with acrylic paint on a brush is not very feasible. It's not going to stick particularly well. It does need to be primed. The problem with putting it in place and then priming it is that your spray can primers, most of them are going to eat away at your foam. I think there might be a few that don't, but you really run the risk of damaging the foam and having it eaten away. So yeah, prime them first and then put them in place. I already had them hot glued in place, so that was no longer an option. What I did was I made a cardboard template with the shape of the skull, and I put it over the foam and I sprayed it, and I was pretty light on my spray, and I made sure to be a certain distance away. So I think it worked out okay. And even if it ate away at the foam a little bit at that point, I felt like it was something I could correct because I was still in the building process. But I go through, I have the skulls in place. I'm adding in some scraps of XPS foam that look rocky around the skulls, and I'm hot gluing those in. And then I want the bottom of the ramp to be rocky, and it's super smooth plastic right now. And, you know, this took a long time to dry, and maybe this wasn't the best method for doing this, but I just put a huge layer of PVA glue and a bunch of small scraps of XPS foam that were jagged, and I just kind of threw them on top of the PVA and then put another layer of PVA over it. This took forever to dry, probably close to a full day to dry. So that doesn't bother me so much. I find that when I'm working on these types of projects, usually I have about an hour to work on it, and then I have to go to work, or an hour to work on it, and then I need to go tend to the kids or, you know, do chores at the house. So for me personally, I don't find that I tend to have, 5 or 6 hours straight to work on a project. Every once in a while I do, but typically it's, okay, I got 20 minutes, let's see what I can get done, and then I'm going to come back to it much later. So if the dry time is a concern for you, don't do massive amounts of PVA in an area because it does not necessarily dry quickly. I think that's also dependent on the weather, and the weather here right now is very rainy. It's not super cold, but it's definitely cool, rainy weather, and that doesn't help your dry time on PVA at all, as opposed to where I live. In the summer, it gets up to 110, and it's rather dry. The dry time, I think, is significantly reduced, so keep that in mind as well. But I'm going for a rocky look on the ramp. Now, there's going to be a ton of gaps here because this is just kind of like a kind of a blunderbuss approach to this. And I have a few things in mind, and I'm planning on filling in those gaps later, but I want to get the bulk of it just kind of covered, and I'm going to come back to it later. All right, so the PVA blunderbuss portion under the ramp is dry and it's workable at this point. But I'm looking at the area where the ramp meets that center structure, and I want that to have a more gradual widening as opposed to just kind of that cylinder and then boom, the flared out spiral ramp. So I'm adding in these big chunks of XPS foam so that it's a little bit more gradual and it's gradually widening. And I'm using the hot glue gun here. I think that it's a good application for the hot glue gun, and I do want to be able to immediately move on to the next step. So I do that all the way around the ramp from top to bottom. All right, so another tip I learned from Black Magic Craft is the use of Sculpt Mold, which you can find on Amazon. It is a nice hobby product, in my opinion. I've used it a few times on different projects. So it's super workable. You just add water. It's kind of like making pancake batter. So it's just the powder, and then you add some water to it. You want to get, in my opinion, about the right consistency for making pancakes if you've done that before. And then you can apply this, and it takes 12 to 24 hours to dry. And then it's really durable. It's very hard and sturdy. I do like adding a little bit of PVA into the mixture as well. But all I do is I mix it up. Now what I'm going to do with this is work it into the areas where there's gaps between the XPS foam and fill in the various gaps that I still have. And I'm also going to use this product to kind of create a smoother transition between the skull and the structure, because right now it's pretty abrupt. Now I'm going to have to do this over several sessions here, because the bottom of the ramp, I'm going to let the Sculpt Mold dry with the terrain piece upside down. That way there's just no concern that gravity is going to pull it off of the piece or change how it's sitting. So I'm focusing on the bottom of the ramp right now. And then later on, I'll focus on other areas with the terrain piece upright. But I'm using a spoon, a plastic disposable spoon. I'm just scooping it out of my disposable gallon. I love saving the milk gallons, empty milk gallons, and just cutting the top off and using it as a temporary container for this kind of thing. So I do try to reuse things, and I am just kind of placing that in, and then I'm working this in with a brush. I think this is pretty rough work for a brush, but I'm using a brush that I don't care about. I wouldn't use a good brush, but I'm kind of using the brush to push it in between the areas of the chunks of XPS foam and fill in the gaps that definitely I knew were going to be there. So I knew that the method that I used wasn't going to get total coverage of the piece, but this kind of fills it in. And I'm also being mindful of what kind of texture I'm leaving behind on the Sculpt Mold, and trying to do that in a way that the Sculpt Mold, when it dries, that it does look like rock. So I work my way all the way around the bottom of the spiral ramp, filling it in with the Sculpt Mold, and then I let this dry for, I think, about 18 to 20 hours. So with the Sculpt Mold on the bottom of the ramp dried, I flip the terrain piece over, and I'm doing a very similar process here now at the top, focusing on any of the small gaps that are still there between the spiral and the ramp. And I'm just filling those in, and I'm using the paintbrush to just push the Sculpt Mold into those gaps so that it does look like this is one massive stony structure that's been just carved and hacked away at. So I don't want any big gaps between the ramps, so I'm just filling those in. The other thing that I do along the whole ramp, where the plastic part goes vertical, and essentially it kind of creates a 90-degree angle on the ramp portions, is I put in a little layer of Sculpt Mold so that's more gradual and it's not such an abrupt angle that seems like it wouldn't be a natural angle to have even if you were carving out this stone thing. So you see me right here just working that into that little edge piece so that it kind of has a more of a curvature there on both sides. At this point, I'm going to add coarse sand to the ramp. The ramp itself, even with some of the Sculpt Mold ending up in the middle it's still too smooth, and I want it to look like these are just like a graveled area, a walkway leading up. So I just put a healthy layer of PVA here. I'm not concerned about warping. I'm really not that concerned about the dry time at this point. I want to get good adhesion with my sand. So I'm going to brush it around. I'm going to try to get it fairly even. And then all I do is take a scoop full of this coarse sand that I have, and I'm just going to kind of pour it on, and I will, gingerly kind of push it in place. And then later on, I'm going to come over this with a little bit of a Mod Podge spray and just kind of seal it in. But I do that all the way down the ramp. Eventually, although I let the ramp dry first, I'm also going to do this same process all the way around the perimeter of the piece as well. So another tip that I picked up from Jeremy over at Black Magic Craft is applying a mixture of Mod Podge and black acrylic paint to your XPS projects. So I'm making that mixture here. There are definitely a couple of reasons to add the paint. One is, I think, to dilute the Mod Podge. When you're applying this directly just with Mod Podge, you definitely run the risk of losing some of your detail on any of your terrain carving on the XPS foam and things of that nature. So it makes it a lot more durable, but you do run that risk. So the black paint kind of dilutes it. It makes that less of a problem in my opinion. Also, it allows you to see where you've already applied it. Otherwise, it's more translucent and it can be hard to tell what areas you have or have not applied the mixture to. I think I might be a little heavy on the paint with my mixture based on the thickness, so I do add a little bit more Mod Podge. But all I do is I paint this over the entire piece and then let it thoroughly dry. And finally ready to move on to painting. I'm going to be tackling this painting project by doing a series of dry brushing highlights, starting with a dark gray, going to a medium gray, light gray, and then working my way all the way up to ivory. Fun fact here, the channel was almost named Painting in My Undershirt because apparently that's all I ever do now that I look at these videos in the editing process. As I go on to the next layer, slightly lighter layer of gray, I am applying a little bit less paint, a little less pressure as I'm doing it. So my initial base coat, I'm not quite trying to get full coverage, but I'm really going at it. And there's a fair amount of paint on the brush, and I'm applying a fair amount of pressure. I think dry brushing stone like this is definitely the way to go, and you do want to just get subsequently less and less paint on with each subsequent color that's a little bit lighter. Focusing on the edges, focusing on the higher parts as you adding on the next coat. On my gray stone painting, when I go to do that ivory coat, I'm really just trying to get the edges, get the uppermost pieces. You can easily go overboard with this like light ivory last highlight and kind of lose all the gray underneath. So I am very careful with that. In those instances when that happens, then I'll go back and hit it with a black wash, but I try to kind of nail it on that dry brush the first time here. So what you see here now is just that last coat. It's ceramic coat, ivory, and my goal is just to kind of get the piece to pop and have some light areas mixed in with, still some exposed black, some dark gray, some medium gray. So that's kind of the overall effect here. The last thing I do once I have it painted is a clear coat of the Tester's Gloss Coat, followed up by the Citadel matte spray. I find that those sprays are fine with the foam, but your mileage may vary, so be careful. And here you see the before and after. I'm going to declare this a success, another Goodwill challenge done in the books. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please do consider liking and subscribing. Bye for now.